Welcome back to this week's episode of The Emily Show. Thank you for hanging around. We had a few weeks off as I was traveling around to see my kid perform Drum Corps International. For those of you that are like, Emily, what are you talking about? It's the Major Leagues of Marching Band. It is a whole marching band situation. For those of you that know, you know, go Green Machine. So that's where I've been the last few weeks and covering trial and getting ready to cover trial. What trial? Well, the Kohberger trial. What Kohberger trial exactly? That's what we're going to be talking about today. There are some questions I have received over and over and over again regarding Bryan Kohberger's plea, sentencing, and what comes next. We're going to talk about that today, including what are the rules around whether or not he can make money off of his story. It is probably the number one question I've gotten, and it's not a super easy answer because law. So we're going to talk about how that works in Idaho and whether or not Bryan Kohberger could down the road ever make money off of selling an interview, a story, what have you, because again, it's the number one question I've been asked. We will talk briefly about what's happening next in the Sean Diddy Combs case. Now that the verdict is in, when will he be sentenced? Is he still in jail? And I have seen so many like reels and shorts with just all of the wrong information. Diddy is still in custody. We're going to talk about it. Will Diddy go to prison? Probably. And we're going to talk about it. So that is what we're covering today. The docket is quite full for live streams coming up in the next few weeks to talk about all of the other cases I'm tracking. So for today, we need to dive into these two topics. So let's get into it. I'm legal analyst Emily D. Baker, yes, also a lawyer, and this is The Emily Show. I break down the pop culture, entertainment, and high-profile cases that we're all talking about. I know you want the facts, so let's get into it. Starting with the Sean Combs case, yes, the verdict came in late last week. Everything it feels like happened at once. The Sean Combs verdict, news that Bryan Kohberger was taking a plea, Bryan Kohberger actually taking a plea. We're still on kind of the looking at the Karen Reed case because there's news still coming out of people doing interviews and talking about the case still. So it feels like the law has been moving very fast. So for those of you that are like, what is happening in the Sean Diddy Combs case? The jury came back with a split verdict, meaning they found him guilty of some charges, not guilty of some charges. So talking about the Diddy verdict, I think it's helpful to just look at the final superseding indictment that they were working off of and go through what he was acquitted of, what he was convicted of, and then we will talk about what happened after all of those verdicts. So in the superseding indictment, this I think is the third superseding indictment that they filed where they added additional charges. Count one is the racketeering conspiracy. This was always going to be the more confusing count, but it's also like the kitchen sink count where the prosecution can bring in tons of other acts that aren't charged acts. So a lot of information fell under the racketeering charge that he was acquitted of. So on the racketeering, they found him not guilty. Whether or not it's because the jury found that he was keeping this information from his team, or he found that the record label was not acting as an organization, the defense leaned into that this was Sean Combs's private life and the government is trying to criminalize his private life. They acknowledged that he was abusive, that there was domestic violence in his relationships, but they argued that that was discrete within each relationship and was not part of a larger racketeering scheme. And it seems that the jury is agreeing with the defense here with coming back with an acquittal, not guilty on count one. It's one of the counts that carried some of the more significant potential custody time up to life in custody, as do the trafficking charges. And when we're looking at the trafficking charges in count two and also count four, he was acquitted or found not guilty of those. Those charges are technically, the name of the charge is sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. So when we're looking at what the jury may have done here, the force, fraud, and coercion is a large part of this charge, different than the trafficking Mann Act charges that he was convicted of. And in these charges, there is one for his partner who testified under the alias Jane and Cassie Ventura, who testified, and we know who is referred to in this indictment as victim one. So those charges, as to Cassie on count two, covered from 2009 to 2018, which is the movement of the person by force, threats of force, fraud, or coercion, and involving the engaging in commercial sex acts is all part of that human trafficking charge. Again, Diddy's defense leaned heavily into the argument that these were not ideal relationships, that they were not good, that Diddy's behavior is not okay, but that it's also not criminal in this way, that it is domestic violence, but it is not sex trafficking. It is not trafficking. There is not coercion there. And the government brought in experts to explain coercion to the jury. And the jury came back with not guilties on both of the sex trafficking charges. And I can only imagine that part of that was due to the means of force, threats of force, fraud, or coercion, because when I looked at the testimony coming out of this case, I'm like, the jury can find these charges. They didn't, which means there are things that they did not believe to come to these verdicts. But I think on all of the testimony I saw in this case, I can see where the government proved this if the jury believed the evidence and if the jury saw the evidence the same way I did. So on the trafficking counts, I was surprised by the verdict of not guilty on those counts, because based on what I saw with the case, I think that the government proved that. Also, the feds put in quite a lot of evidence, particularly as to Cassie, not just of video, but of other witnesses and witness testimony. So I was surprised with these particular verdicts. If any of the jurors choose to speak out, it will be interesting to hear what they have to say. On count 3 and count 5, the transportation to engage in prostitution, those involve the transportation to involve sex acts. And I think it would be pretty hard for the jury to deny that that happened, because there's so much evidence that that happened, that individuals were transported and they were transported to engage in sex acts. So I'm not surprised that they found that. But as to count 3 and count 5, those are the least serious of the charges that Sean Combs was facing, which is why at the end of those verdicts coming in, his attorneys asked that he be released pending sentencing. And the judge told the attorneys, well, we're here for a full workday, so why don't you go ahead and brief that and then come on back and let me know. And oh boy, did that happen. So the court did not agree with the defense on this. The court did not release Sean Combs pending sentencing, and the court set sentencing for October. That is the sentencing date. And we know that federal sentencing takes quite a lot of time. In other cases, I've seen the frustration of, what do you mean they got convicted and then they're just out for another 4 months waiting for sentencing? Well, those pre-sentencing reports can take a bit of time. And in this case, we saw the government arguing that the pre-sentencing report was absolutely necessary and needed to be completed before the sentencing, though the government acquiesced that that could be done on an expedited basis. So Sean Combs is still in custody. He was denied the bond conditions or bail conditions that his attorneys asked for and is staying in custody until sentencing. Now they will be back in court on Tuesday, July 8th for an expedited sentencing hearing where the judge will hear from the attorneys arguing that this should be expedited, and then will probably ask for or hear from a representative to do the pre-sentencing report and how quickly that can be done. But the pre-sentencing report can only be expedited so much. So I don't expect sentencing to happen at the end of July. Sentencing is going to happen down the road. What does his sentencing look like now that he's been acquitted of the most substantial charges he was facing? Well, the counts he was convicted of both have individual victims, which means they can stack or they can be consecutive one after another. So he can face up to 20 years in custody. Is 20 years a realistic sentence on this? No, it's not within the federal sentencing guidelines, and it's unlikely he will get that much time. However, I think what's really notable is that even when the defense was arguing that Sean Diddy Combs should be released pending sentencing, they argued that they think the sentencing is going to be in a range of about 21 months or just under 2 years. So even the defense is acknowledging that this is going to be a prison sentence because this is going to be a prison sentence. How long of a prison sentence is the question, and certainly shorter than it would have been had he been convicted of the other charges. But the court can consider a lot of the factors that they learned about during the trial because of the trafficking. The trafficking of the two victims involves all the other things that happened to the victims that the court is able to consider in sentencing. The government is asking for between 4.5 to 5.5 years on this. That's what they said in their memorandum regarding the bond bail request. So the government says they might be asking in that 4.5 to 5.5 year range. That's what the guidelines indicate, and that it could be lower than the actual guidelines. So will we see the government asking for double digits? Probably not. But will we see the government asking for something in that 4 and 5 year range? If not a little bit more, probably. So is Diddy out of custody? No. If anyone says that Diddy's like running free, he's not. But will he be going to prison for decades? No. Will he be going to prison for some amount of time? Yes. That time will be reduced by the amount of time he spent in custody pending trial. And that's been 8-9 months at this point. If sentencing really goes till October, he will have been in custody a year. He went into custody in September of 2024, and he will get that credit. So if he's sentenced to 21 months and he's already served 12, then he's not going to be spending all that much time in prison. And then if he agrees to do some of the different prison programs, his sentence can be reduced in the way you've seen reports in like the Jen Shaw sentencing. You see her release date keeps getting closer in time. It's because there are prison programs that you can participate in that will take time off of the top of your sentence. So we will see ultimately if the sentencing date gets moved from October. We will see the court's decision shortly after, I would imagine, that July 8th court date when they're trying to expedite sentencing. The defense is going to be asking again, it seems, for about 21 months. And the government will be asking in that range of 51 to 63 months, if not a little bit more, which is about 4.5 years to about 5 years and a little bit. So the government can ask for more. And again, the judge can sentence to more. He has to have a reason to do it when you look at the federal sentencing guidelines, but that can happen. But he is not going to get 20 years on this conviction. He probably won't get 10 years on this conviction. So for the government, that 5-year range really is what I think they're going to be looking for. When the sentencing memorandums come out, I will let you know. And when we hear when the sentencing date will be, I will let you know. Because again, at the end of the verdicts coming in, everyone in the courtroom reported that Combs said out loud, "Oh, I'm coming home, baby, I'm coming home." I think that after those not guilties came in, Combs thought his attorneys would have him released from MDC immediately, and they did not. The court kept him in custody until sentencing. I don't think he was happy with that at all. So with all of that, Diddy was acquitted of most of the counts, convicted of 2, will likely face a prison sentence, but it will be a much smaller prison sentence than he would have faced had he been convicted of all of the charges against him, which is a huge win for his defense team and a pretty substantial loss for the feds, who really take cases to trial with a massive amount of evidence. And I think if we see any of the jurors talk, I will be interested in what evidence they credited and what evidence they discounted, because there will be discussions of whether this was overcharging, whether this was the jury disregarding victims, and there will be much discussion about that. But I really want to hear from the jurors, and I don't know if they will. So we'll see. So in other news, talking about who's spending the rest of their life in prison, we know it's not going to be Diddy, but it is going to be Bryan Kohberger. And I have seen a lot of questions and confusion about what his plea deal is. I think it just happened so fast last week that there really was a lot of almost whiplash with what is happening in this case. News started coming in on Monday, June 30th, 2025, that Bryan Kohberger was going to be taking a plea deal. And that news I covered on live stream. I'll link that if you want to go see the entire stream, from a letter that the victim families received from the prosecution indicating that Bryan Kohberger was taking a plea deal. Then he was back in court on July 2nd to change his plea, admit guilt, and take that plea deal. At the beginning of the hearing, Judge Hippler, in a different courtroom in Boise, the same courtroom that the Denied Bail cases had been in, gave a breakdown of why he chose to take that plea so quickly and why it was put on the docket so quickly. He also indicated that he was caught by surprise. He was planning on this going to trial and did not know until later on Monday that this was going on to the docket. He said there would be up to 10,000 members of the community sent a jury summons for this case to hopefully get a portion of those back on jury questionnaires. And yes, I'm not exaggerating. He said 10,000 potential jurors. He also indicated that that entire courthouse in Boise was going to be essentially closed to trials for the week that they were starting the bulk of their jury selection. I've not heard of a court choosing to say we can't do any other trials because of the vast amount of jurors we're going to be processing in this case. So if the change of plea was going to happen, it needed to happen with enough time to stop jury services from sending out all of those jury subpoenas. And if the plea wasn't going to be taken, then there needs to be enough time to actually get enough jurors to start the trial on time, given that the judges schedule their calendars out 3 to 6 months, if not more, in advance, and closing the courthouse for the week of jury selection can't really be moved at this point because it's too close in time to that jury selection process starting. So I appreciated that he spent the time to talk about why this was put on the docket so quickly. I know there was a lot of speculation about that, but it seems by all accounts that after the June 26th denials of a continuance and the denials of the alternate perpetrator, which I covered on live stream on Monday the 30th, after those denials, by all accounts, the defense went to the prosecution and asked for a plea deal, and the prosecution said that they would allow Bryan Kohberger to plead guilty to everything he's charged with, and in exchange for that guilty plea, they would ask for the maximum sentence without the death penalty, which is 4 consecutive life sentences, in addition to 10 years on the burglary charge. So instead of me just retelling you what the plea deal is, we are going to go to court real quick as the judge reads in the plea deal and then talk about what that means, because I'm still seeing some confusion about what this plea deal means because of the way the judge explained it. But this is a stipulated and agreed upon plea deal, which means when Bryan Kohberger comes back for sentencing at the end of July, on July 23rd, he is going to be sentenced to life plus life plus life plus life plus 10. The sentencing will give time for impact statements, will give time for the prosecution to make a statement, and if they want, for the defense to make a statement, but the defense isn't going to be able to argue for a reduced sentence, not now and not in the future. So let's take a look at the judge going over what the plea deal entails.
For the record, I have a written plea agreement which indicates in sum, the defendant will plead guilty to all 5 counts in the indictment: burglary, felony, and first-degree murder, 4 counts. The state and the defendant stipulate that is that the defense is not free to argue for a lesser sentence at sentencing to the following. The defendant on the burglary charge will be sentenced to 10 years fixed, and that the defendant on counts 2 through 5, the 4 counts of first-degree homicide, on each count would receive a fixed life sentence, all 5 of those counts to run consecutive to one another.
A fixed life sentence, not a variable to life, not a 10 to life, 25 to life, 50 to life, a fixed life sentence, life, period. Just a life sentence, and then 4 consecutive. Consecutive means one after another. Is that a practical sentence? Well, no, because you're not going to serve life sentence after you have served a life sentence. But oftentimes you will see those sentences stack in case there's an issue with one of the counts. That's not the case here. The judge is going to go through exactly what he is waiving, so there's no appeals, but the life sentences are the max for each charge, and honoring that each one of the victims is being represented in the sentence. So life plus life plus life plus life plus 10. So it is a fixed life sentence.
Defendant, as part of the plea agreement, waives his right to appeal, as well as his right to appeal the sentence and his right to seek leniency or reconsideration of the sentence under Idaho Criminal Rule 35.
The defendant waives all of his appellate rights, including the right to seek leniency and the right to seek reconsideration. Reconsideration of sentence is what we're seeing in the Menendez case. He is waiving the right to have his sentence reconsidered or to seek leniency down the road. There will not be parole. There will not be release. There will not be resentencing. Even if the laws in Idaho change down the road, he is waiving the right to seek those things. So he has waived all of his appellate rights. He has waived the right to argue for leniency. He has waived the right to argue for reconsideration down the road, no matter what the circumstances are. It is done. So when he is sentenced, it will be a fixed life sentence times 4 plus 10. In addition to court fees and fines, in addition to restitution. We're going to talk about restitution more in a minute.
This is not a Rule 11 agreement, meaning the court is not bound by the plea agreement and could impose a different lawful sentence at sentencing. The stipulated agreement between the parties is the maximum on each count. So theoretically, the only thing the court could do would be a lesser sentence at sentencing. But the defendant is not free to ask the court to do so under the plea agreement.
And I think that's where some of the confusion came in with the court indicating that this is not a fixed sentencing. However, the court does acknowledge at the end of that the only practical outcome would be for him to reduce the sentence, but that the parties stipulated and agreed that this is a maximum sentence. So sentencing in this case is really more of a formality because they've already agreed. It is a fixed life sentence, so life period. You are never getting out of prison. The things that will happen at sentencing will also be the request for restitution, fixing any court fees and fines that go with the case, and then the ability for impact statements. And that's what will happen at sentencing on July 23rd, and if needed, into July 24th. The parties both waived a pre-sentencing report. They said they don't think they need it because they've agreed that this is a max sentence plea, fixed life. So that is it. He will not be paroled. He has waived his right to ask for parole. He has waived his right to ask for any appeals. So he will spend the rest of his life in prison. That is what he has agreed to. And that is what the plea agreement is. And that's what the sentencing will be. The unknown at sentencing will be if he makes any statements, which I doubt, and what statements the defense attorneys make, if any, and what statements, if any, the prosecution makes, and what the impact statements will be. No doubt they will be incredibly difficult, sad, and hard. But I think it's an important part of the process. So I will be streaming it. We will be going through the sentencing day together if you want to join me on live stream for that. And I went through the entirety of this hearing with the law nerds and then explained, and I'll link that down below. Other things that happened at that hearing is that he was asked for a factual basis where the court said, "Are you pleading guilty because you are in fact guilty?" Kohberger answered yes. And then he went through the elements of the indictment and asked him to agree to yes on all of those elements, and he did. So he admitted that he was pleading guilty because he was guilty. He admitted to the elements of the crime and then changed his plea to guilty. So that is really the end of this case going to trial. He's admitted guilt. He's changed his plea to guilty. The only thing left is for the sentencing. But there were a lot of other questions about this case, including what about Bryan Kohberger's appearance in court, which is not something I generally comment on, but it was noticeable, so we're going to. And what about victim restitution? What about his ability to make money from this case? Those are both things that need a little bit more of an answer. So we're going to talk about them because the one thing that came up in the comments and in the live chat was Bryan Kohberger looks different. His hair is cut. His eyebrows look different, if at all. And so we're going to pull up some of the photos, not the video, but the still photos from court and take a look. You can let me know what you think because his appearance in court was different. I think up until sentencing, the defense was still preparing for trial. This is my opinion on that because they had to. The defense had no way to know that if they went to the prosecution and said, "Hey, I know we're right before trial, but can we have a plea deal?" They have no way to know that the prosecution's going to say yes, and the prosecution doesn't have to. And in this case, the defense couldn't go to the court and say, "Hey, Can you give us a plea deal? Because that would require the prosecution agreeing to take the death penalty off the table. The court cannot make the prosecution seek the death penalty, but they also can't make the prosecution remove it. They are separate branches of government and separate entities. So the court can't make the prosecution do that. That is within the power of the prosecution. If the prosecution had chosen not to give a plea deal here, there was nothing left to do but go to trial, and I think they were preparing for that. So in taking a look at some of the photos we've seen of Bryan Kohberger vis-a-vis the photo in court, I think there's a noticeable difference. Yes, his hair is shorter, but yes, his eyebrows are also less noticeable. So in this is his booking photo after his indictment from Ada County. Again, longer hair, facial hair, longer eyebrows. Some of his photos from court were even more noticeable, and we're going to go through a few of those. The photo I pulled up is one of his first court appearances in this case. Again, more noticeable, but the defense team has commented on how often the media has talked about his eyebrows being dark, have talked about his eyebrows being heavy, and then we went through all those motions talking about whether or not the witnesses, in this case, the surviving roommates, would be allowed to talk about seeing someone with quote unquote bushy eyebrows. So I'm not surprised that his appearance in court was different. The next photo is also from one of his early court appearances in 2023. And then, of course, the photo that we heard the prosecution talk about, which is Kohberger's photo that was included in prosecution documents, the selfie of him giving a thumbs up in apparently a bathroom that was used as part of the prosecution's motion. This was taken about 9 a.m. the morning of the 13th, and it's a photo that the prosecution was going to use to show that Bryan Kohberger in this selfie looked similar to how he is described or how an individual is described by the witnesses. The witnesses never identified Kohberger. They described an individual, and the jury would have been able to look at this photo and see if they thought that those things matched. They're not going to now because there won't be a jury due to the plea. But the photos in court are of Bryan Kohberger looking noticeably different. But when we see Bryan Kohberger in court for his change of plea, his hair is noticeably different. His eyebrows are noticeably different. And it's something that I had seen commented on a lot. Generally, I do not comment on defendant's appearance in court. However, it is a noticeable difference to me, and it is significant in that there were motions regarding his eyebrows, and there were motions regarding the description. So for me, it appears that his eyebrows are mostly gone in court. So he has a haircut. The eyebrows are much, much different in court. We're going to look at one or two other photos from court because I think it's not just one angle of the photos. And this is coming from the pool photographer from the AP who was in court. So they are the high resolution photos. And we have seen other photos from other angles. It looks to me also like his eyebrows are very, very, very close cropped. And that does not surprise me. So in the last photo I'm going to pull up is just a photo of Bryan Kohberger with his attorney, Ann Taylor, again from the side. And you can see how trimmed his eyebrows are. You can, from the side, barely see them, which is incredibly different than what we saw in photos of Kohberger from 2023 in his earlier court appearances. So it is a noted difference. And I am not surprised as they were preparing for trial that his hair was closer cropped, that his eyebrows were closer cropped. It is not unusual that appearances will change of defendants. I've seen defendants grow facial hair, shave facial hair, lose weight, gain weight, grow their hair out, cut their hair all off. It's not unusual that if someone has the opportunity to change appearance a bit before trial, that they will. We even saw that with Sean Combs. And though we mostly see it through drawings in court, he let his hair go completely gray. So giving himself, sweaters in court, hair completely gray, looking like a different person than maybe who the jury remembers him as from music videos or television or from the videos that the jury was seeing in court. It's not uncommon, but it is something that was noticeable in this case. And as we talk about the sentencing for Bryan Kohberger on July 23rd, a lot of you have asked me, what if he sells an interview? What if he sells the rights to his story? What if he signs a movie deal like Karen Reed? And for those of you going, girl, wait, what? Yeah, that happened. It happened while everything else was happening. But Karen Reed signed a deal for the screen adaptation of her story. So if we want to talk about it more, let me know in the comments. We'll get into it another day. But what if he chooses to sell the rights to his story? Well, that brings up the question, what about Son of Sam laws? And for those of you that are like, Emily, what? The Son of Sam laws are called that based on a case out of New York. It was the first case that really codified a rule that someone who had been charged with or convicted of a crime could not profit off of the rights or selling that story in some way and couldn't profit off those deals. It was a first of its kind law in the 70s or the late 70s in New York because serial killer David Berkowitz sold the rights to his story. He was a serial killer known as the Son of Sam because everyone names everything, especially when we're dealing with crime. And he had sold those rights, and then New York passed a statute to prevent that. So they became colloquially termed Son of Sam laws, which are really about whether or not someone can profit off of crime. The Son of Sam law, as it was in New York, got overturned by the Supreme Court in the 90s because, well, the First Amendment does exist, and this law was considered to be an overbroad restraint on speech. If we want the full legal history of what courts have overturned Son of Sam laws, we can go through it. Not every state even has a law like this on the books. New York has rewritten their laws. So the laws in Idaho model after the newer versions of these laws because most of them have been struck down, and a lot of jurisdictions don't have laws like this because of the First Amendment challenges they face in court. So there is a longer legal history there when you look at the rights of anyone to speak and the rights of like a book publisher, like, I don't know, Simon & Schuster, who sued New York over the Son of Sam laws to publish a book. And then you try to balance that with the public discomfort of someone profiting off of something that they did and profiting off of talking about the victims of their case. It's a difficult balance with the First Amendment and one that courts continue to struggle with. So what does that mean for Idaho? What does that mean for Bryan Kohberger? Idaho does have a very specific statute on this point. And so we are going to take a look real quick at the Idaho statute. This is their current statute. This is a still standing statute. And the way a lot of jurisdictions have changed those so-called Son of Sam statutes to deal with compensation and to try to address the First Amendment concerns. So in Idaho, this is under Title 19, Chapter 53, compensation of victims of crimes. And it lines out that anyone who is contracting with a person or representative or assignee of a person accused of a crime in the state with respect to the reenactment of such crime. And then they list out movie, book, magazine article, radio, television presentation, live entertainment of any kind. And they list out almost every type of maturation of content regarding the person's thoughts, feelings, opinions, or emotions regarding the crime shall pay over to the state treasurer any monies which would otherwise, by terms of the contract, be owing to the person convicted or his representatives. So they put it in escrow in Idaho. So if Bryan Kohberger was to sell the rights to a story and be entitled to monies from that, whatever company was paying him would have to put it in escrow with a state treasurer, and then it can be distributed to victims if they make a legal filing asking for that. And it's held in escrow for 5 years to allow time for requests to be made. But those legal filings have to be made proactively by the victims, and the treasurer is required, as the statute says, once every 6 months for 5 years from the date it receives the funds to publish legal notices in the newspapers of general circulation. So they need to advise the victims of crime that escrow money are available to satisfy money judgments. So when we talk about whether or not restitution will be ordered here and whether or not Bryan Kohberger can pay restitution, having restitution on the books allows for any of the victim families and surviving roommates to later make a motion if he were to sell any rights. If that money was to go into escrow, they could then make a motion down the road. So it allows a process where the money is held in escrow and it can be made. So this is how we are seeing some of the newer statutes, not saying you can't profit, but if you are to be paid, any compensation owing to the victims gets paid to them first, which is why we see restitution still being requested, even if there's not a possibility that at this point he could pay it, because down the line, he may be able to pay it. And then having that on the books makes it easier for the victims to bring the type of civil filing they would need to have access to that money held by the state treasurer. So upon disposition of charges favorable to any person accused of a crime, or upon showing such persons that 5 years have elapsed from the establishment of the escrow, then it can be paid to them. So there's a 5-year period to make these motions for anyone who is entitled to money under this statute that may be held there. So that is the longer and shorter answer of, can Bryan Kohberger profit off of his story? Yes, but it would go into escrow. There would be the ability for anyone he owes restitution to then move for those escrow monies to be paid to them. So can he be paid? Yes, but it would go to the victims. And that's what we're seeing. Not that you can't be paid, but that if you are paid, it goes to the victims first. And that's what we are seeing in more states, but not all, because there are numerous states that still do not have statutes like this, where any monies made would go to victims and to compensate victims first. So hopefully that answers the question of, can Bryan Kohberger profit off of this himself? And then what happens with representatives of Bryan Kohberger? And if his family members are representatives of Kohberger, could we see civil action over whether or not and who is considered a representative of Bryan Kohberger? If those things move forward, if there are any books or movies or what have you, then I don't doubt that we will see this come back into the court system. And I will be keeping an eye on that if it does happen down the road after sentencing, so that I can answer your questions about it. So hopefully that answered some of your questions about who's going to prison, who's not going to prison, how long they're going to prison for. And it doesn't answer the one big question of what's next. And for that, you're going to have to tune into the live streams this week, because we're going to be talking about some of the other cases that are coming down the road to trial. So for now, thank you for being here. Thank you for being a Law Nerd. Thank you for downloading the Law Nerd app and staying in touch with live trials with me. I appreciate it. And keep an eye on your Law Nerd app for some announcements regarding things coming in the merch shop, because we are doing a restock. So you will get to see that if you have the Law Nerd app. Otherwise, you're going to have to tune in to the live stream on Tuesday to hear more about it. So I will see you in the chat. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a Law Nerd. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for joining me. If you enjoyed this episode and don't want to miss updates on your favorite cases, you're going to need the Law Nerd app at lawnerdapp.com. That way you can stay in the loop on the cases that matter most to you, and you never know when you're going to catch feelings for a new case. So make sure you get it for free on iOS and Android. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being a Law Nerd.